Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Would you please stand for the Australian National Anthem? Thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wangal people, traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all of you on this commemoration concert to mark the 80th anniversary of the events of the 14th of June 1941. I'd like to especially welcome our guest speakers today, Jaroslav Duma, the Honorary Consul for the Ukrainian National Republic, Sulev Kalamäe, Honorary Consul for the Republic of Estonia, Mārtiņš Tuktēns, Honorary Consul for the Republic of Latvia, Ginta, Honorary Consul-General for the Republic of Lithuania. And a special welcome also to Ieva Happinen, who is the Chargé d'Affaires of the newly established Embassy in Canberra for the Republic of Latvia. For the people of the Baltic States, the 14th of June 1941 is as emotionally charged and significant as Anzac Day is for Australia. It is a day that Baltic people commemorate every year around the world, and multi-decade anniversaries such as this one make us reflect on those events even more acutely. At the back of this hall are a series of posters describing the events of that day and also the period of Soviet occupation that followed. I invite you to have a look at them after the concert. Indeed, the 14th of June 1941 is the major reason why most of us, those who came post-World War II, are here in Australia today. 3 years after the events of 1941, as the German army was retreating from its invasion of Russia, and as the Russian army was advancing to reoccupy the Baltic States for a second time, many people, with the memory of 1941 and the repression of the Soviet regime still fresh in their minds, took the opportunity to escape from the Baltic States. I now invite Pastor Colvin MacPherson to lead us in prayer. Colvin.
If you could please stand. Today, as we commemorate the events of 80 years ago, we think of the words of Jesus when he said, "In the world you have trouble, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." We know all too well what happens when a godless force is in power, what man will do to man. And therefore I think it's appropriate today that as we seek God's blessing upon our lives and upon our countries, that we pray with the words of St. Francis, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. We pray together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the peace of God, which passes all human understanding, keep your hearts, your minds in Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen. You may be seated.
Thank you, Colvin. Switched off. For this 80th anniversary, the presidents of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have made a joint statement, which is in the form of a video presentation. We'll now play a video of their statement.
On this day, 80 years ago, Soviet forces occupying Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania carried out a mass deportation.
Tens of thousands of people, including the elderly and children, were turned from their homes and placed in cattle trucks for the long journey to Siberia.
Many died. Some returned to broken lives.
More deportations followed.
Almost every family in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania has a story to tell.
Today we can observe a moment of silence to remember the victims.
But we also need to speak up.
Events like the 14 June deportations happened for a reason.
They happened because two evil regimes, Nazi Germany and Soviet Communist regime, had made a secret pact to carve up Europe.
With no regard for sovereignty, human rights and the rule of law. These two regimes caused untold misery and suffering.
The consequences of Soviet occupation are still felt today, 30 years after restoration of independence.
That is why Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania value their independence, freedom and democracy.
That is why we are committed members of the European Union and NATO.
That is why we cherish our transatlantic bonds.
That is why we are alarmed about the global spread of disinformation and false narratives about European history, about the Russian violation of the borders of Ukraine and Georgia.
Today, the June deportations serve to remind us. As the late Congressman Tom Lantos said, the veneer of civilization is just paper thin. We are its guardians.
And we can never rest.
In the video clip that you just saw, the Estonian president made a reference, quoted Congressman Tom Lantos. Tom Lantos was an American congressman, Hungarian American, who was speaking from first-hand experience of experiencing life under the Soviet regime. The Joint Baltic Committee has also received the following message from the Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison. To the members and friends of the Joint Baltic Committee, Australia stands with you as you commemorate the events of June 1941. Today, you assert that violence and oppression can never diminish life, family, community, and human dignity. During decades of repression, the nations of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania preserved the spirit of democracy. Today, Australia joins them in reflecting on their path to sovereign independence and nationhood. It is an achievement celebrated by generations of Australians of Estonian, Latvian and Lithuanian heritage. The first post-war migrants from those nations arrived in Australia in 1947. Emerging from the sorrow of displacement and loss, they brought energy and enthusiasm to a new life in a new land. They joined the many millions of people from all over the world, of different faiths, backgrounds and language groups, who have shaped and shared in Australia's success as a peaceful, prosperous and outward-looking multicultural nation. It is in the freedom of Australia's democracy that we can look back united in our diversity and mourn the tragedies of the past. As we commemorate the sacrifices of 1941, we declare our commitment to a future in which acts of repression, intolerance and discrimination have no place. Signed, the Honourable Scott Morrison MP, Prime Minister of Australia. Thank you, Scott Morrison. I should like to acknowledge the open welcome extended by Australia to migrants from the Baltic States in the post-war years. The tolerance and acceptance of Australia has allowed us to maintain ties with our cultural traditions and languages whilst being citizens of Australia. Some of those traditions of music you will hear in today's concert. And in the foyer is an exhibition of paintings by Latvian artists, which I invite you to view. I'd like now to call to the podium Jaroslav Duma, the Honorary Consul for the Ukrainian National Republic, a country which well understands what has been experienced in the Baltics, and a country in which in recent years experienced Russian expansionism in Crimea. Please.
Mr. Chairman, my dear colleagues from the Consular Corps of Sydney, Messrs. Kalamäe, Tuktēns and Vilnius, Madam Chargé d'Affaires of Latvia, Reverend MacPherson, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks to the Chairperson, Mr. Ojārs Greste, and members of the Joint Baltic Committee of New South Wales for your very kind invitation and honour to be at today's commemoration, remembering the 80 years since the forced indignation suffered by Latvians, Lithuanians and Estonians of being sent from their homes to the Siberian Arctic lands in an attempt by the communist Muscovites to also remove any traces of the Baltic peoples. I am most honoured to represent Ukraine and the Ukrainian people on this occasion, and note that like the nations of Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, we Ukrainians have undergone decades of similar genocide through the horrific and atrocious acts of Moscow's regimes. from Stalin to today's evil empire headed by Putin and promulgated by his henchmen throughout the region. It was not enough to murder millions of Ukrainians in 1932-33 through Stalin's forced famine, the Holodomor genocide of the Ukrainian people. It was not enough to incarcerate and murder hundreds and thousands of people, including most of the intelligentsia, the religious and clergy, the freedom fighters before, during and after the Second World War. It was not enough to murder Ukrainian leaders living in the diaspora post the war. Today, that evil continues through the terrorist acts of this vicious regime, which just cannot accept that all nations and all people should and must live freely and in a democratic society. We only need to recall the murder of 298 civilians, including 38 Australians, in the shooting down of MH17 over eastern Ukraine by a Russian military manned Buk missile launch, and the even more recent poisonings of anti-regime spokespersons throughout Europe. Yes, Crimea was all but the first step of further subjugating freedom. There is so much to say on the illegal occupation of Crimea by Russia. We all know that Moscow ignores international opinion and history on this topic and continues to manipulate the truth in all forms, as it does with its opinions on its war with Ukraine. Are we surprised? Not really, nor should we be, as we have endured decades of mistruths. In fact, just plain lies from Moscow and its muppets stationed around the world, including, sadly, in Australia. The war in eastern Ukraine has thankfully been held off first by a volunteer army in 2014, and since by a strongly built-up defence force which has, in less than 7 years, managed not only to retake some of the territory initially taken by Russian troops and their quisling supporters, but has staved off the possible incursion further west and potentially kept Russia at bay from many of the territories of the former Soviet Union. While in this war, Ukraine has lost some 14,000 plus people, and well over 2 million displaced people have fled the war front. And throughout this period, we all know that Crimea is in Ukraine, and it will eventually be returned to the Ukrainian fold. The people of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania and Ukraine, together with others under the former Soviet Union, have jointly suffered at the hands of this monstrous regime over many decades. Today, it's time to ensure that the world not only remembers those atrocities, but understands that Russia and its leadership continue to be at the forerunners of terrorism and chaos in the modern world. War is not fought with just a gun in your hand on some remote battlefield. Today's wars are also fought in a closed room somewhere around the world in an attempt to mask the truth and hide the facts from people. We should perhaps reflect on the well-known words by Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is that good men should do nothing. But it may also be time to especially note another of Burke's citations some 10 years later as some food for thought. And I quote, "When bad men combine, good men must organise." May God bless the nations of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, and forgive my language skills. O Balti Rachvastele, Slava Baltijos Tautai, Šlovė Baltijos Tautoms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaroslav. Music and choral singing in particular is an important part of Estonian, Latvian and Lithuanian culture. Singing lets us express our national pride, and it has helped our nations get through hard times. So, as an introduction to the next three speakers, you will hear a song that is particularly dear to each nation. I'm going to now in a moment invite Sulev Kalamäe to the podium, Honorary Consul for the Republic of Estonia. But before Sulev takes the podium, let's listen to the Estonian song. I'm not sure of the Estonian pronunciation, so I'll give you the English translation, Awakening Time.
Awakening Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps of Sydney. You have just listened to Ärkamise, or Awakening Time, one of the pivotal patriotic songs of what has become known as the Singing Revolution, a movement that led to Estonia reclaiming its independence in August 1991 after 50 years of Soviet occupation. It is now 30 years since that historic moment when the three Baltic nations finally regained mastery of their own destinies, something we can all celebrate. However, this year also marks 80 years since the infamous night of 14th of June 1941, when over 10,000 Estonians, the majority of whom were women and children, without warning or valid reason, were arrested and shipped in crowded cattle cars to the distant Siberian gulags. This tragedy was repeated across the three Baltic nations. It is believed that over 3 days between 14th of June and the 17th of June 1941, a total of some 50,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. As we all know, most perished from hunger or cold, and only a few were ever able to return home to their homelands. The Soviets repeated this whole terrible nightmare again in March 1949, when another 20,000 Estonians, including farmers who had resisted the Russian collectivization regime, were arrested and again deported to Siberia. Estonia's Baltic neighbours also suffered similar mass-scale deportations. The tragedy and the horror of what happened to the Baltic States 80 years ago today has left a deep scar on our collective memories and are to us part of our important story. One only has to visit the memorial to the victims of communism just outside Tallinn to comprehend the enormity of the scale of human suffering inflicted on our peoples by an evil ideology, one that offers a worker glorious paradise but instead delivers a miserable hell. I believe it is our responsibility and duty to keep retelling this story to the world, to honour the memories of those tens of thousands of victims who are now long silent. Whilst they have lost their voice, it is our duty to speak out on their behalf. Whilst horrific and unpleasant, these crimes against humanity need to be exposed and talked about, if only to prevent them from occurring again. If we do not, it will only serve to dishonour their memory and of those who have perished. This year, at the suggestion of the chairman of the Joint Baltic Committee, we have agreed to provide some personalised accounts of those harrowing times. I would therefore like to refer to my mother's memoirs, which have just been published in Estonia. Now, although my mother was not amongst those who were deported to Siberia, I do believe her first-hand recollections of that era will contribute to the historical record and our better understanding of those difficult times. Before I relate from her book, I would like to explain that what is not generally well known is that in that period of the first 12 months of the Soviet-Russian occupation of Estonia, and before the events that we are commemorating today, already over 5,000 Estonian citizens had been deemed enemies of the state and arrested by the NKVD. Those arrested included political leaders such as our president, members of parliament, businessmen, school teachers, policemen, key military officers, and so on. In essence, anyone who had the intelligence and the potential to challenge the new masters was a threat. Their disappearance from society was happening in a relatively covert manner. People were continually hearing rumours, and there was increasing fear who was going to be next. My mother writes in her memoirs that it was 3 months into the Soviet occupation when a moment of destiny almost happened to her. My mother had grown up in the town of Viljandi in southern Estonia. She was 18 years old, just finishing high school, and full of anticipation of going to university the following year. Near her home was a bronze statue of a popular local war hero from the Estonian War of Independence between 1918 and 1920. This statue was of Captain Anton Irv. She would walk past his statue every day on the way to and home from school. One fateful morning in September 1940, she was shocked to come across a group of men who had surrounded the statue and had tied a rope around its neck. They were trying to pull Captain Irv down. A circle of concerned local townspeople had gathered around. All were shocked to see what was happening. My mother joined this crowd in a moment of disbelief about what was being done to her favourite war hero. The men were having no luck pulling the statue down with the rope. It simply wouldn't budge. One of them finally went off and brought back a truck, and they tied the rope to the truck, and then the statue of Captain Irv initially resisted all efforts, but then eventually the statue snapped off at the knees, and to my mother's horror, it came tumbling down onto the ground in a cloud of dust. At that point, my mother became quite emotional as an 18-year-old and yelled out, "Mörtsukat," which translates to murderers. People around her in the crowd whispered, "Be quiet, girl, be quiet, go home." But it was too late. A man standing right in front of her turned around and studied her, looked her up and down and asked, "Who are you? What is your name?" It turned out this gentleman was Hans Tomusk, the local Communist Party political police commissar. He had heard everything my mother had said. "So," he said, "you think we, the struggling working class, are murderers, do you? What is your name? Where do you live?" He carefully wrote down her details and menacingly said, "Expect to hear from me again." Those words brought dread and terror into my mother's young heart. She ran home in tears and told her parents what had happened. My grandfather said he knew what to do. He put on his coat and walked up to the local Communist Party headquarters in the centre of town. He came back an hour later and told my mother that it all had been sorted and to stop worrying. It turns out that Commissar Tomusk had previously been a building foreman, and some years before, my grandfather had actually employed him to help build the family home. When the house was finished, my grandfather had put on a big lavish lunch for all the workers and for the foreman as a sign of thanks for a job well done. This generous act, which was unusual, apparently stayed long in this fellow's mind. And so, on learning that it was his daughter who had spoken out, assured my grandfather that in this case, thanks to his previously demonstrated generosity to the working class, no further action would be taken. 9 months later, in the early hours of 14th of June 1941, my mother was woken up from her sleep by noises in the street outside her house. She looked out her bedroom window and was shocked to see the family across the road being herded into a truck by Russian soldiers. These soldiers were reading out from lists of names, and if not found at home, demanding to know where these individuals could be located. Over the next few weeks, it became increasingly known that thousands of families had been rounded up all across Estonia. My mother's family was very relieved that despite the incident with the statue 9 months earlier, it appeared that their family had somehow escaped this fate. From that night onwards, my mother never slept in her own bed. Sometimes she would sleep in the apple cellar, sometimes in the chicken shed, another time behind the wood pile. She always kept a small carry bag with her, packed with some clothes and her precious photo albums. She could not get the image of Commissar Tomusk out of her mind. Just a week after the 14th of June mass arrests, the Germans attacked Russia, and they reached southern Estonia by early September 1941. Found in the abandoned local Communist Party headquarters were carbon copies of typed lists of names of Estonians who were to be scheduled to be arrested for future deportations. My mother's name was on those lists, despite the reassurances of Commissar Tomusk. She had been scheduled for the next wave of deportations to Siberia, and it had only been the German invasion that had spared her. For many decades, my grandparents and my mother came here to Latvian House for past Baltic deportation commemorations. In coming here, they knew exactly how close they had come to sharing the sad fate of many of their fellow Estonians. And they knew the important duty to keep retelling this story to the world, to honour the memories of the tens of thousands of victims who are now long silent. Whilst they have lost their voice, we can still speak out on their behalves. I do agree that these personal stories help us to relate to events that happened 80 years ago. Certainly it has been the case for me. Can I leave you tonight to contemplate a few relevant lines from the story from the song that you just heard called Ärkamise. With fire, with the sword, a stranger came, brought woe, brought pain, ate foreign bread. Father fell, so did mother, brother while still a child. The whole land became wet with tears. I will leave it to the next speaker, the Honorary Consul for the Republic of Latvia in Sydney, Mr. Mārtiņš, to continue the telling of our shared sad story.
Mārtiņš Brauns un Rainis, Saule, Pērkons, Daugava.
Dirige Romāns Vanaks.
Salutations to all our distinguished guests and to you all today. Fellow Balts, my name is Mārtiņš. It's a bit emotional when you watch something like that, don't you agree? So I have to just take a deep breath. I'm the Honorary Consul of the Republic of Latvia and New South Wales, and in the Northern Territory, a very important part of Australia. I have the honour to serve Latvia and its people, and I find myself in an amazingly unique position to be a proud dual citizen, both of Latvia, the land of my heritage, and Australia, the land of my birth. Today we gather and remember those who were deported from the Baltic States of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania on the 14th of June 1941. We cannot also forget the subsequent deportations that occurred around 1949, where a far greater number of people were sent to similar fates. It would also be remiss to not also remember similar atrocities that occurred at the same time in other European countries, Poland, Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, and other parts of the USSR. Our history, actual facts, and the figures are well known to us Balts. However, in the spirit of keeping my speech brief, I will not go into any detailed history of our countries, as our histories are quite complex, and indeed long and many before me are better versed. Such events as today are important to commemorate and importantly recount these events of our nation's histories, not only amongst ourselves, but importantly to remind all the other inhabitants of the globe of our plight. The people of the three Baltic states are diversely unique in many ways. We have our individual languages, cultures, and heritages. We do, however, share a common geography and an unfortunate common tragic history. Closer to home, I take great pleasure in seeing that the three Baltic nations are now working together in Canberra to establish their extremely important diplomatic presence in Australia, and I wish them every success. It is important to realise that not much has changed in the world today. There are still wars in Ukraine, as we've heard, refugees fleeing Syria, tensions with our neighbours in close by Belarus. It is through these important diplomatic missions that we retain our rightful place in the world, and we can, as the Baltic nations, have our voice heard, to work collectively with the rest of the world to ensure that these historic atrocities do not occur, or the current injustices continuing in silence. I look forward to see what our next generation of Balts will be able to achieve in our now free democratic countries. Now is not the time for the rest of us to rest on our laurels, and it is now time to build our nations. I've been asked today to talk about a personal recount of the events pertaining to the deportation of the thousands of Balts. I firmly believe that today's commemoration of the deportations should also reflect on the start of the attempt of the actual disassembly of our nations, the disassembly of the family unit, and the subsequent loss of our national identities. No one in my immediate extended Latvian family was deported or found themselves in prison camps such as Siberia. Although the fact that you and I, most of you sitting in the audience today, are indeed here today living in Australia, and the fact is that due to these immediate relatives were no doubt in many of those lists of those people to be deported, as Sulev just mentioned. Each one of these relatives, although were somehow able to flee their impending fate, and many suffered and endured a different form of hardship. Many personal family stories have evaporated as the generations before me were just not comfortable to tell their stories to the subsequent rest of us, or indeed able to recount their own personal horrors and experiences of displacement, loss of family, isolation, discrimination, army conscriptions, depression, and the list goes on. Although each one of us Aussie Balts owe their own personal attributes, I believe, to their forebearers, and have no doubt been shaped by all of these previous experiences by our previous forebearers. We are true survivors, quiet achievers that generally punch well above our weight. Today in Latvia, In Latvia today, to commemorate the events of the 14th of June 1941, the names of the deported will be read across the country and worldwide as proof and evidence that we will remember each and every individual who perished and became a victim of Soviet terror. Memories of our family will live forever in our hearts. This list can be watched as it is probably currently starting soon due to the time delays on deportations.kartas.lv or www.lsm, which is the TV station or the online presence of the TV station. The website Deportations Kartas is well worth having a look as it contains a graphic representation of the names of those deported from each region in Latvia. It will also contain a compilation of photographs of today's commemoration events that have occurred in Latvia and the worldwide Latvian diaspora or diaspora. Today's topic. Many books and personal recounts have been written about the events relating to the deportation. These have all been important sources of information, such as The Children of Siberia, There Was Such a Crime, a Latvian memoir of deportations to Siberia, Suddenly a Criminal, We Sang Through Tears, With Dance Shoes in Siberian Snows, and most importantly, a series of books that I've just come across myself only yesterday, the series of books called Aizvestie, which was compiled by the Latvian Archives, which was released in 2001 for its 60th year commemorating the deportation, which contains a detailed list of the complete list of all the people that were deported or Aizvest from Latvia. It was a gut-wrenching experience for me to see and to read such a complete, compiled, extensive list of people all in one tome of books. Although today I would like to make reference to a recently published novel, Sydney via Siberia, written by Inara Strung. Inara grew up in Sydney, and I myself went to Latvian school with her sister Sylvia, so that makes it a little bit more personal for me. Inara now lives in Brisbane and is here today in the audience, and I hope that she doesn't mind me giving her work a plug. The book cover or the blurb reads, on a midsummer's night in 1941, a family is illegally arrested by order of Stalin in cosmopolitan Riga, Latvia, and deported in cattle wagons to the frozen wilderness of Siberia. 60 years later, the son Laimonis, aka Lucky, now an actor, visits Sydney and recounts the events to his long-lost sister Myra and her household. I literally could not put the book down and read the entirety in 2 sittings. Although the book is fiction, it is no doubt based on personal real accounts. It is a clever way, in my view, to communicate the events surrounding deportation by recounting the life of a Latvian/Australian family who lives on the shore of Botany Bay in Sydney, and Laimons visiting from Latvia who was deported to Siberia. Mara, at a young age, managed to flee Latvia and subsequently settled in Australia, where she now has become a renowned architect. Maybe that's why I like the book so much. I would like to read a few excerpts from the book. I wanted to be an actor ever since I was a young boy, loving to perform in front of others. I had my sights set on studying drama and joining a theatre company when I was old enough, but in 1941, when I was 11 years old, something happened that threw a spanner in the works for the rest of my life. It was midsummer and warm, and we were all in a holiday mode. So it was unusual that on the 14th of June 1941, our parents were woken early, about 4 a.m, by a knock on the door of our apartment in Riga. They soon woke me as well, and I was shocked and frightened when I saw 2 soldiers and 2 civilians standing in our apartment. The soldiers carried guns, spoke Russian, and looked unapproachable. The other 2 men in suits and spoke Latvian, but they didn't seem any friendlier than the first 2. "Surrender your weapons," barked one of the civilians. "I don't have any," said my father. "I'm a doctor. I save lives and I don't take them." One of the civilians read out a special directive from a sheath of paper held in his hand. It said my father Carlos Latsis was to be arrested for anti-Soviet activity. Him and his family included his wife and children who were to be deported for 20 years. I didn't know what that meant. They told us to get ready. We sat in a lorry in the early morning light with many of our neighbours and acquaintances. None of us knew where we were going but thought it was to a local prison. To my surprise, we were transported to Torncon railway station, which can be seen as the memorial back on the screen as a backdrop here. Here, there were many cattle wagons already filled with men, women, and children. That was the last time we saw a father, a tall intellectual man with glasses who left for Siberian snows in summer clothes. Finally, on the third day, soldiers came and called our names of people to be deported. We were to sign a piece of paper saying we were going willingly. Many decades later, when Latvia was free again, I went to the National Archives and found a record of my father's court case. It had occurred many months later in Siberia, and he had been interrogated, tried, and sentenced for being an enemy of the people, according to the infamous Article 58. Reasons quoted were exploitative behaviour by owning apartments, having fought in the National War of Independence, and being a member of a student fraternity. So began our new life in Siberia, 5,000 kilometres from home, a fate shared by 15,500 other Latvians, including 2,500 children under the age of 10. You may think of Latvia as a cold place, but Siberia is even further north, and that includes the Arctic Circle. Many people have heard of the prison camps of the Gulag, but not of the forced deportation we underwent. We were in our own prison for being hardworking, owning property, being educated, and being, most importantly, Latvian. I would recommend to all of you to buy a book and buy the book, and see how Inara has written a powerful book in English, which is most importantly for all of us to absorb and indeed reflect of the atrocities of deportation. The book itself conveys the atrocities in such a way that even the next generation, including my own daughters and my niece, who basically will be more aware of the heritage and ensure that none of these events will occur ever again. This book can be viewed in the bookshop today along with the representation of the other mentioned books that I've just mentioned. May we never forget the cruel injustice and the illegal events relating to the deportation to ensure that these events will never happen again. My very best wishes to you all, and I would like to introduce you Ginta, not Ginta as we would say in Latvian, Vilnius, the Honorary Consul-General for the Republic of Lithuania. Thank you very much.
Oh afternoon, fellow members of the 3 Baltic communities in Sydney, members of the Sydney Diplomatic Corps. A special welcome to our esteemed Ukrainian guest, Honorary Consul Jaroslav Duma. And may I take this opportunity to extend thanks, I'm confident, on behalf of every single person in this room, to the members of the Joint Baltic Committee who have toiled, I think is the better word, to arrange today. I don't want to think about how many emails we've exchanged with the extremely diligent Ojārs Greste, and it's a very fine tribute to them. Thank you to Sulev Kalamäe and Mārtiņš Tuktēns, Jaroslav Duma, for their addresses this afternoon at this august commemoration of the exile 80 years ago today to Siberia of many thousands of Baltic deportees. Sulev Kalamäe shared his mother's memoirs. A heartfelt thank you, Atya. With love, he recalled for us the historical events which we are here to remember, the suffering which we are here to respect. Thank you, Sulev, for taking us back, especially through the personal and poignant voice of your family through your mother, to the experiences and tragedies of 1941. Through your words, we have been able to collectively pay our respects to those who were displaced and those who were killed. There is so much pain and so much tragedy to remember. Paldies to Mārtiņš Tuktēns, I don't think I've got that pronunciation right, I'm sorry, who invited us to reflect on the significance of recording these achingly painful events. The mass deportations were truly horrific in their scale, in their gravity, in their savagery, and in the grief which they visited on the tens of thousands of Baltic deportees and their families. Recording these events is crucial. It is critical for the purpose of remembering them. To borrow the well-known words of Rudyard Kipling, immortalized by the Anzacs, lest we forget. However, as Mārtiņš demonstrated through sharing the recently published Sydney via Siberia by Latvian author Inara Strunks, the recording of these historical events has another purpose and function. It is important so as to foster and support healing, closure, stability, and in spreading the word. But I will not travel over the same ground as my 2 fine Baltic colleagues. Rather, my focus is to invite you to consider why we do this. I invite us to contemplate the fact that we who are gathered in this hall today, in common with Baltic communities the world over, gather annually, year after year, to recall, to remember, and to reflect. We remember the massive human tragedy which culminated in the diabolical events of 14 June 1941. But why? What is the relevance, the utility of the Baltic diaspora continuing to gather and remember these events? Is there any point? I revisited thoughts shared with previous audiences at this commemoration and found this line from a Ukrainian commentator. And I quote, "If we deny and lie about what occurred, we only risk repeating the same unspeakable horrors." That depressed me. I took a rather desperate, bleak view and postulated that it doesn't matter what we say or we record. It is clear that as a human race, we have not learned any lessons about the wisdom of not repeating the same unspeakable horrors. The evidence is in the very fact that we're here today. Had we learned anything, there would not have been a war after the very first one, whenever and wherever that may have taken place. There certainly would not have been any Baltic deportations, any Holocaust, any Hiroshima, nor any of a diabolically long list of historical tragedies, culminating in devastation and death of millions of innocents. And the passage of time, together with the assistance of the entertainment industry, can result in a certain glibness, a tendency to file these events away in the annals of history, almost sometimes to dismiss them, perhaps within the convenient parameters, the convenient confines of a Netflix series. In the extreme, perhaps because of their very horror, it may be a type of coping mechanism. Indeed, there are those who deny that tragic events have occurred, but today is not the day to have that conversation. The tragedy of the events about which we speak this afternoon is magnified by the fact that humans have not learned from it. The fact is that there is war, terror, torture and savagery amongst humans on planet Earth every single day. This is achingly tragic evidence of the capacity for totally base and feral behaviour which seems to be a part of the human condition and always has been. So I repeat my question, why gather? Why remember? What can we learn from these episodes? Have we learned anything? It seems not. Indeed, some say that commemorations such as today's, along with similar ceremonies, Anzac Day services, Holocaust commemorations, and other gatherings, the purpose of which is to remember and reflect, are part of the precipitate and not the solution. It has been said that to gather together as we have today, to remember and to reflect on the evils perpetrated in Eastern Europe and Siberia in the 40s, keeps the atrocity alive, even glorifies it. I find myself wondering whether this is not so. Is there no hope for us? Glance at the media and news coverage. There does not seem to be a moment on earth when someone, somewhere, is not killing a fellow human, often in the name of a religious belief, or to protest against a social order adopted by others. Is there any room for optimism? Is cynical realism the only sensible, non-delusional mindset to adopt here? If there can be said to be an entry on the credit side of the ledger, it is this: selfless generosity. Humans regularly and frequently respond with exceptional generosity in the face of disasters. A sterling example is refugee programs. Although these programs are, by their very nature, nuanced, political, and challenging, the fact is they exist. Countries do provide shelter, and often a new start in life, for victims of war and unrest in their own homeland. Indeed, a significant proportion of the Baltic communities experienced the Australian version of this generosity after World War II, in the form of the assisted passage and resettlement programs which Australia had in place in the 40s and beyond. Both my parents were beneficiaries of these programs. The many sponsorship programs for those, especially children, living in appalling conditions of wartime squalor and poverty also come to mind. And humans respond generously to the needs of victims of natural disasters, witness the recent bushfires and floods. And it does not seem right to not mention COVID-19 these days. Even in that sphere, we see that in the last 24 hours, the G7 leaders have pledged 1 billion vaccines for less well-off countries. All of this generosity is every bit as uplifting and inspiring as the events which trigger the need for the generosity are tragic. Random acts of kindness from one total stranger to another do occur, and they occur often. Sadly, this generous side of the human spirit often only emerges in times of abject misery. So dare we hope that by coming here today to remember the victims of the 1941 and 1949 and other deportations, they will not have suffered and died in vain. I, for one, hope so. A scant hope, but nevertheless a worthy one. Taken together with the inspiringly positive generosity which humans regularly display, in the hope of a chance of one less deportation, one less Holocaust, one less religious war, even one less senseless episode of street shooting or random violence with tragic consequences, in the name of a belief in something or someone, I consider this is worth the hoping. I will finish in what I consider and hope is not too naive an exercise in optimism. I do think there is a point in meeting to commemorate, to reflect, and to remember, even if, perhaps especially because, we are remembering and reflecting on particularly ugly moments in human history. I have said it before and it bears repeating. The Anzacs got it right with "lest we forget." The sense of legacy from these words reflects the visceral human need to acknowledge sacrifice, to express respectful gratitude. That is why we gather. That is why we remember. I would like to take a very small step, together with my consular colleagues, and show respect for those who, as a result of these events, lost their lives and their families by saluting them in Baltic languages. In Estonian, Juni Balti Kuditus. In Latvian, Junia deportations. In Lithuanian, Birželio trėmimai. Thank you for your attention, and until next year.
Thank you, Ginta. Thank you, Sulev. Thank you, Jaroslav. Thank you, Mārtiņš. Before our concert, I'd like to invite to the podium Ieva Appina, Chargé d'Affaires of the Latvian Embassy in Canberra.
Good afternoon, everybody, distinguished Honorary Consuls of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Ukraine, leaders of Baltic associations in Sydney, dear compatriots of the Baltic States. It's a very historic privilege to stand here in front of you on behalf of first ever Latvian embassy in Australia. And it is with respect also to my relatives in my family. They were deported twice, in 1941 and 1949. No doubt, deportations have special place in the history of the three Baltic states. They are part of the political repressions during the occupation of the USSR, but in the consciousness of the people, they have remained especially bright. They have influenced the collective memory of the people, the system of public values, and national identity. There is no family in the Baltic states that does not have its own story about Siberia and its relatives who have disappeared in the cold. These stories are very similar to all of us. Only the persons in operation change. But the time and the place of deportation, torture and lawlessness are the same. And this tragedy and the crime is only 80 years old. Today, there are dictators at the borders of our countries. A month ago, we experienced the unprecedented act of the terrorism in the air of the 21st century. The airplane was easily hijacked, and the opposition leaders were arrested by brutal use of force. And we are witnessing a denial of a freedom of expression in the neighboring countries like Belarus and Russia. We are witnessing crimes being committed to our borders, and this is a warning and alarm call to the whole world. And therefore, I would like to emphasize and express my wish. May the tragedy with such huge human casualties never happen again in the lives of our three Baltic states. And let us never have to experience the loss of our sovereignty again in the history of our three Baltic states. We must be vigilant and protect the security of our countries every day. We must respect and remind that to our children. We have to tell them about this tragic history of our countries so that they do not make mistakes and be on guard of the future and development of our countries and people. Dievs svētī visas trīs Baltijas valstis, un Dievs stāv klāt Ukrainai.
Thank you very much, Ieva. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the concert part of our program. I invite on stage now Lithuanian vocal ensemble Atspindis, who will be followed by the Estonian Choir Kooskõlas.
bērnu žēļa griežančā, už bērnu žēļa katra kepure, kvētkeļu padabint. Už bērnu žēļa katra kepure, kvētkeļu padabint. Tu krēla mana auginta, tu krēla mana ketinta, ilgai nešoksi ir nedainuosi, kvētkelis greit nuvis. Ilgai nešoksi ir nedainuosi, kvētkelis greit nuvis. Neperkalbėsi motula, neperšnekėsi senuola, un ta bernela širdela gula, akelas padėtas. Un ta bernela širdela gula, akelas padėtas. Sa
ask the choir to remain on stage, please. Would you please stand for the singing of the Estonian, Latvian and Lithuanian national anthems.
Okay.
Yanni, could I have the next slide, please? Those of you who've been coming to this commemoration for some years will have enjoyed the small Latvian pastry filled with bacon and onions, which were baked by this man, Mārtiņš, who'd been doing that, who'd been supplying pīrāgi to the Latvian cafeteria, to the Latvian community for many years. Sadly, he passed away in April this year, so we won't be enjoying his pīrāgi, at least this year. Well, from now on, but we will source some for you in future years. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to say a few thank yous before we conclude. Thank you very much to all our guest speakers, to Jaroslav, Sulev, Ginta, to Ieva Apinen. Thanks to Colvin MacPherson for the prayer, to the Lithuanian ensemble Atspindis, the Estonian Choir Kooskõlas, to Wojciech Wiśniewski for your piano accompaniment, to Liena Svelis for your wonderful flower arrangement and greenery on stage, Andris Kariks for the stage decoration, Jānis Krauts for setting up lighting and sound, Toivo Rosenwald for setting up the poster display at the back of the hall, Sydney Latvian Ladies Committee, and in particular Loreta Juriana for assisting with catering and flowers, my colleagues Juha Luver and Kristina Virgeningas for helping to source the Estonian and Lithuanian video clips, Peter Sklavins of the Sydney Latvian Society for your ongoing support. Special thanks to my Melbourne colleague Anita Andersson for sending me the video of the statement by the three Baltic presidents, Sydney Latvian Society and Chairman Jānis Čekšiņš for your annual support for this commemoration. Thanks also to my colleagues in the Joint Baltic Committee for your collaboration. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming today. Let us keep alive the memory of all those who suffered from the events of 14th of June 1941 and remain vigilant so that such tragedies do not happen again. Thank you, and please join us for some refreshments at the back of the hall. Thank you.